A single photograph, not a grand painting or a famous battle scene. Just a modest portrait taken in 1888 inside a small, unremarkable studio. The kind of place where working families saved up for months to afford a single sitting. In that image stands a black family. The father, tall and serious, wears his finest dark suit. The mother sits beside him in a high-collared dress, her hands folded with quiet grace. 4 children gather around them, 2 boys, 2 girls, all dressed in their Sunday best. Their faces are solemn, not sad but dignified. They look directly into the camera lens as if they understand the weight of being seen. For more than a century, this photograph sat forgotten in an archive, buried in a cardboard box, labeled with nothing more than a studio name and a date. Just another relic of the past, another anonymous face among thousands. But then, modern geneticists decided to take a closer look. Using advanced imaging technology, they examined the matriarch's eyes, those dark, steady eyes staring out from the sepia tones. And what they found was extraordinary. A pattern in her irises that should have been impossible. A genetic signature so rare, so specific, that it traced back across the ocean through centuries of war and slavery and silence all the way to African royalty that the world had long forgotten. This wasn't just a family portrait, this was evidence, proof of a bloodline that slavery had tried and failed to erase. If you want to discover how one photograph rewrote history, how it reunited a scattered family with their royal heritage, then make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Because trust me, you won't believe where this story goes. Chapter 1. The Basement Discovery. Dr. Maya Richardson stood alone in the basement of the Smithsonian Institution. The air was cool and still, thick with the smell of dust, old paper, and something that felt like time itself. Around her, cardboard boxes were stacked on metal shelves, each one labeled in faded handwriting. Virginia Studios 1008, 181,890. Unidentified portraits, donated collections. For 3 months, Maya had been working on the African American Heritage Photography Project. Her job was simple: catalog thousands of images from the post-Civil War era. Most were damaged, torn corners, chemical stains, silver fading into ghostly blurs. Others were so faded that faces had almost disappeared entirely. She had grown used to squinting at ghosts. But this particular morning in March 2019, she pulled down a box that seemed no different from the others. She opened the lid and began flipping through its contents, and then she stopped. The photograph was remarkably well preserved. Almost impossibly so. A family of 6 seated and standing in a formal studio arrangement stared back at her. The backdrop showed a painted garden scene, a little romantic, a little fake, very typical of the era. But the family was anything but typical. The father stood tall to the left, one hand resting gently on the shoulder of his seated wife. His dark suit was neatly pressed. His expression was serious, almost commanding. 4 children surrounded them, 2 boys in miniature jackets, 2 girls in white dresses with ribbons in their hair. All of them looked directly at the camera, no smiles, just quiet, unmistakable dignity. Maya lifted the photograph carefully, turning it over. On the back was a photographer's stamp, crisp and legible. J. Morrison Studio, Richmond, Virginia. September 1008, 188. She had seen hundreds of similar portraits. Dozens of families, same poses, same painted backdrops. But something about this one felt different, the way the family held themselves, the way the mother's hands rested in her lap, not clenched, not nervous, but steady. There was a pride here that transcended their circumstances, a silent declaration: we exist, we matter. Remember us? Maya placed the image on her light table and reached for her magnifying glass. Standard procedure: age, condition, number of subjects, location. But when she leaned in to examine the details more closely, the texture of the father's collar, the pattern of the mother's dress, her breath caught. The woman at the center, the matriarch, she had the most striking eyes Maya had ever seen in a photograph from this period. Even through the sepia tones, even through the soft blur of 19th century photography, there was something unusual about those eyes. A clarity, a sharpness, a depth that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of 1888. Maya sat back, frowning. She had worked with historical photographs for over a decade. She knew the limitations, early emulsion processes, long exposure times, primitive lenses. Eyes in these old portraits were almost always dark pools, soft, blurred, lacking detail. You couldn't see irises. You couldn't see patterns, you barely saw expression, but this woman's eyes were different, sharp, almost luminous. And there was a pattern visible in the irises that Maya couldn't quite make out with her magnifying glass alone. She glanced at the clock, nearly noon. Her colleague, Dr. James Chen, worked in the digital imaging laboratory upstairs. If anyone could help her see what she was seeing, or prove she was imagining it, it was him. Maya carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve and headed for the elevator. Chapter 2. The imaging lab. James looked up from his computer screen when Maya entered the imaging lab. He took one look at the protective sleeve she was carrying, like it contained something precious, something fragile, and immediately recognized that look on her face. He had worked with her long enough to know it meant one thing. She had found something interesting. "What have you got?" he asked, pushing his chair back from the desk. "I'm not sure yet," Maya admitted, laying the photograph gently on the scanning bed. "But there's something about this woman's eyes. I need you to scan it at the highest resolution possible." James raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. He had learned to trust Maya's instincts. She wasn't the kind of historian who got excited about nothing. He adjusted the settings on the professional-grade scanner, a machine designed specifically for archival work, capable of capturing microscopic details invisible to the naked eye. Then he initiated the process. The machine hummed softly as it began its work, scanning every square millimeter of the 131-year-old image. 5 minutes later, the scan appeared on his monitor. He opened the file in specialized imaging software and began to zoom in on the matriarch's face. Maya stood beside him, her hand gripping the back of his chair. "There," she whispered, pointing at the screen. "Do you see it?" James leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. Then he zoomed in further, first at 200%, then at 400%, focusing entirely on the woman's left eye. The iris filled the screen, and what they saw made both of them fall silent. The pattern was unmistakable. Even through the limitations of 19th century photography, even through 131 years of chemical aging and physical wear, the structure of her iris showed a distinctive configuration: deep radial furrows, unusually pronounced collarette, and a specific arrangement of crypts that formed an almost geometric pattern. "That's," James began, then stopped. He opened another window on his computer and pulled up a database he had been working with for a different project. A genetic iris pattern recognition system developed by the National Institutes of Health. He input the pattern from the photograph, adjusting for image quality and age. The software ran for 30 seconds, comparing the pattern against thousands of documented genetic markers. When the results appeared, James sat back hard in his chair. "Maya, this pattern is linked to a specific genetic lineage. It's extremely rare. We're talking about something that appears in less than 1% of the global population." He scrolled through the data, his expression growing more serious with each line. "And according to this, it's associated with a particular ancestral line from West Central Africa." Maya felt her heart racing. "Can you be more specific?" James clicked through several more screens, cross-referencing geographic markers, population studies, and historical genetic drift models. Then he turned to look at her directly. "Angola, specifically the royal lineages of the pre-colonial Ndongo kingdom." Chapter 3. The genealogist. 2 days later, Maya sat across from Dr. Patricia Okano in his small, cluttered office at Howard University. Patricia was one of the foremost genealogists specializing in African American family histories, particularly those tracing back to the era of slavery. Her walls were covered with family trees, maps of the Atlantic slave trade routes, and photographs of people she had helped reconnect with their heritage. Maya had brought both the original photograph and James's digital analysis. She watched as Patricia examined everything with the careful attention of someone who understood that these fragments, these scraps of paper and fading images were all that remained for many families. "The iris pattern is definitive?" Patricia asked, looking up from the genetic report. "According to the NIH database, yes," Maya confirmed. "This specific configuration is linked to a genetic marker found almost exclusively in descendants of the Ndongo royal family, the Kingdom of Ndongo." Patricia set the report down slowly. "I know the history," she said gently. "Queen Nzinga, one of Africa's greatest leaders, she resisted Portuguese colonization for nearly 40 years. Diplomacy, warfare, alliances. She died in 1663, but her legacy never died." She looked back down at the photograph. "And you're telling me this woman photographed in Richmond, Virginia, in 1888, carries her bloodline? That's what the genetic evidence suggests." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, studying the matriarch's face. Then she asked, "Do we have any information about the family? Names, anything written on the photograph?" Maya shook her head. "Just the studio stamp, J. Morrison Studio in Richmond. I've been searching through Richmond city records from that period, but without names, it's nearly impossible." Patricia reached for her laptop and opened a database she had compiled over 20 years of research. "Morrison Studio, I know that name. John Morrison was one of the few photographers in Richmond who regularly took portraits of black families during that era. He kept detailed ledgers." She typed rapidly. "I have copies of some of his records. Let me see." She scrolled through scanned pages of handwritten entries, squinting at the faded ink. Dates, names, payment amounts, descriptions of sittings, then she stopped. "Here," she said suddenly, turning the screen toward Maya. "September 14th, 1888. Family portrait. 6 subjects, name given as..." Patricia paused, reading carefully. "The Thomas family. No first names listed, but there's an address. 412 Clay Street, Richmond." Maya leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "That's them, it has to be. Same date, same number of people." Patricia nodded slowly. "Morrison charged them $2. That was expensive for the time, about 2 days' wages for a laborer. They saved up for this portrait." Maya looked back at the photograph. The mother's steady eyes, the father's strong hand on her shoulder, the 4 children, dressed in clothes that had been carefully mended and pressed. Patricia's expression softened. They wanted to be remembered. Chapter 4. Richmond. Maya arrived in Richmond on a gray Thursday morning. The city had changed dramatically since 1888. Highways, shopping centers, modern buildings rising where horse-drawn carriages once traveled. But traces of the past remained. Old brick buildings, church steeples that still rose above the skyline, neighborhoods where generations of the same families had lived and died and left their marks. She went directly to the Library of Virginia, where Patricia had arranged access to city directories and census records from the late 19th century. The research room was quiet, occupied only by a handful of other historians and genealogists bent over their own investigations into the past. A librarian named Mr. Lawson brought her the materials she had requested: Richmond city directories from 1885 to 1890, census records from 1880 and 1900, and property tax records from the same period. Maya started with the 1888 directory. She ran her finger down the listings for Clay Street, searching for number 412. The entries were organized by street, then by number, with the head of household's name and occupation listed. There it was: 412 Clay Street, Thomas Samuel Carpenter. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote it down. Samuel Thomas, the man standing in the photograph, his hand on his wife's shoulder. A carpenter. She immediately moved to the 1880 census, searching for Samuel Thomas in Richmond. She found him on the 4th page. Samuel Thomas, age 24, black carpenter, born in Virginia, and listed below him his wife, Grace Thomas, age 22, black, born in Virginia. Grace, the matriarch, had a name. Maya stared at the census entry, then looked at the notes column. Most entries were blank or contained simple occupations. But next to Grace's name, someone had written in small, cramped handwriting, "Midwife Healer." She continued down the census page. 4 children were listed: Robert, age 5, Elizabeth, age 4, Thomas Jr., age 2, and Mary, age 1. The same 4 children in the photograph, 8 years later. But it was the next entry that made Maya sit up straight. Under a section labeled Parents' Birthplace, there were 2 columns, one for father, one for mother. For both Samuel and Grace, the father's birthplace was listed as Virginia, but for Grace's mother, someone had written, "Unknown, possibly foreign." Foreign in 1880. For a black woman in Virginia. That notation was extraordinary. It suggested something unusual about Grace's background, something that didn't fit the typical narrative of enslaved people born in the American South. Maya pulled out her phone and texted Patricia, "Found them, Samuel and Grace Thomas, and there's something unusual about Grace's mother." Patricia called her back within minutes. "Churches," she said without preamble. If Grace was a midwife and healer in the black community, the churches would have records. Baptisms, marriages, funerals. They kept better records than the city did, especially for black families. Chapter 5. The ledger. Maya spent the rest of the day visiting historically black churches in Richmond. Many had been destroyed or relocated over the decades, but 3 still stood from the 1880s. First African Baptist Church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, and St. Philip's Episcopal Church. It was at Ebenezer Baptist, in a dusty archive room that smelled of old paper and lemon oil, that she found what she was looking for. Reverend Marcus Williams, a man in his 70s who served as the church's unofficial historian, brought her a leather-bound ledger from 1875. "We've kept every record since 1802, he said with quiet pride. "Baptisms, marriages, deaths. This community has always known that memory matters." Maya opened the ledger carefully. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, each entry noting names, dates, and often brief personal details. She searched through the baptism records first, looking for the Thomas children. She found them. Robert, baptized in 1876. Elizabeth in 1877. Thomas Jr. in 1879. Mary in 1880. All 4 children, with parents listed as Samuel and Grace Thomas. Then she turned back further to 1874 and found an entry that made her heart race. Marriage, Samuel Thomas to Grace O'Liddell. October 3rd, 1874. Witnesses, Jacob Freeman, Ruth Freeman, O'Liddell, not a common name in Virginia, not a common name anywhere in America. Maya's hands trembled as she took a photograph of the page with her phone. Reverend Williams leaned over her shoulder, reading the entry. "O'Liddell," he said slowly, "that's a Yoruba name from Nigeria." He paused. But many enslaved people from Angola were given Yoruba names by slave traders. The cultures got mixed together during the Middle Passage. Maya looked up at him. "Is there anything else about Grace? Any other records?" The Reverend thought for a moment, then moved to another shelf. He pulled down a different ledger, this one from the 1870s. "We have some personal testimonies from that era. People who joined the church had to give their testimony, tell their story." He flipped through the pages, then stopped. "Here, Grace O'Liddell joined the church in 1873, before her marriage. There's a note here from Reverend Johnson." Maya read the faded handwriting. "Grace came to us with unusual knowledge of healing herbs, claims her mother taught her, mother deceased. Grace refuses to speak of her origins." Chapter 6. The Slave Ship. Maya returned to Washington with more questions than answers. She had a name, Grace O'Liddell. But the mystery had only deepened. Why would Grace refuse to speak of her origins? What had happened to her mother? And most importantly, how did a woman living in post-Civil War Virginia carry the genetic signature of Angolan royalty? Back at the Smithsonian, she met with James and Patricia via video conference. James had been running additional analyses on the iris pattern, comparing it against expanded genetic databases. Patricia had been searching through slave ship manifests and auction records, looking for any mention of the name Al-Adil. "I found something," Patricia said, her face serious on the screen. There was a slave ship called the Esperanza that docked in Charleston, South Carolina in 1847. Portuguese vessel, it came from Luanda, Angola. She paused. The cargo manifest listed 217 enslaved people, though I'm certain there were more who died during the crossing. Maya leaned closer to her screen. "Did you find the name Al-Adil?" "No, but I found something else. There's a notation about a woman and her young daughter who were separated from the main group when they arrived. They were described as special acquisition and sold privately, not at the regular auction." Patricia's voice dropped. "The notation says the woman claimed to be of royal blood." The room fell silent. James spoke first. "Do we have any way to confirm this woman was Grace's mother?" "Not directly," Patricia admitted. "But the timing fits. If Grace was born around 1858, as the census suggests, and her mother arrived in 1847, she could have been pregnant when she was enslaved or shortly after. The fact that they were sold privately suggests someone believed their claim about royal heritage, or at least saw them as valuable for other reasons." Maya stared at the photograph on her desk. Grace's face, captured in that Richmond studio in 1888, seemed to look back at her across the decades. "We need to find out what happened to that woman and her daughter after they were sold in Charleston," Maya said. "Where did they go? How did they end up in Virginia?" Patricia nodded. "I'll search the Charleston private sale records. Some wealthy families kept detailed records of their purchases, especially if they paid premium prices. And I'll keep working on the genetic analysis," James added. "If we can find any living descendants of the Thomas family, we might be able to confirm the royal lineage definitively through DNA testing." Maya picked up the photograph again, studying Grace's eyes. Somewhere in those eyes was a story that had been hidden for over 170 years. A story of queens and kingdoms, of survival and silence, and she was going to find it. Chapter 7. The Blackwell Plantation. 3 weeks later, Patricia called Maya with news that changed everything. She had found the private sale record in the archives of the Middleton family, a wealthy Charleston plantation dynasty that had kept meticulous records of their acquisitions. Her name was Nzinga, Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. The woman who arrived on the Esperanza in 1847 was named Nzinga. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. Nzinga, the same name as the Queen. The buyer, Charles Middleton, noted in his private ledger that she claimed to be descended from Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba. He didn't believe her, but he bought her anyway because she was young and strong. The child with her was approximately 2 years old. He didn't record the child's name. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it. She named herself after the Queen, or maybe she really was descended from her. There's more. Patricia continued. The ledger says Nzinga was sold again in 1852 to a Virginia tobacco plantation owner named Richard Blackwell. She and her daughter both. Blackwell's plantation was about 30 miles south of Richmond. What happened to them there? I don't know yet, but I found a notation in the Blackwell family papers at the Virginia Historical Society. I'm driving up tomorrow to look at them. Do you want to meet me there? The next afternoon, Maya and Patricia sat in the reading room of the Virginia Historical Society, surrounded by boxes of Blackwell family documents. They found the notation in a letter dated 1858, written by Richard Blackwell's wife, Eleanor, to her sister in Maryland. Eleanor wrote, "The African woman Nzinga died in childbirth last week. She delivered a girl child who survived. The infant is remarkably beautiful with unusual eyes. I have decided to keep the child in the house to be trained as a lady's maid. The other daughter, who must be nearly 13 now, works in the kitchen. She has her mother's healing knowledge and has saved 3 of our children from fever this year alone. Richard wants to sell her, but I have forbidden it." Maya looked at Patricia. the baby born in 1858. That would be Grace, and the older daughter, her half-sister, born in Africa or during the voyage. Patricia's hands trembled as she turned the page. This means Grace never knew her mother. Nzinga died the day Grace was born. They sat in silence, imagining the scene. A woman dying in childbirth on a Virginia plantation, far from her homeland, far from the royal heritage she had carried across the ocean, and a newborn girl opening her eyes for the first time, carrying in her irises the genetic proof of her ancestry, never knowing the woman who had given her that gift. Chapter 8. The living descendant. Maya knew that proving the genetic connection would require finding living descendants of Samuel and Grace Thomas. The photograph and the historical records told a compelling story, but DNA evidence would make it undeniable. She started with the 1900 census, tracing what had happened to the family after the photograph was taken. Samuel had died in 1895. Grace had lived until 1912. The 4 children from the photograph had grown up, married, and had children of their own. The trail led Maya to a woman named Dorothy Williams, who lived in Philadelphia. Dorothy was 76 years old, and according to the genealogical records Patricia had compiled, she was the great-granddaughter of Robert Thomas, the oldest son in the photograph. Maya called her on a Tuesday evening, her heart pounding. The phone rang 3 times before a warm voice answered. "Mrs. Williams, my name is Dr. Maya Richardson. I'm a historian with the Smithsonian Institution, and I've been researching your family history. I found a photograph from 1888 that I believe shows your great-grandparents." There was a long pause. Then Dorothy's voice, quieter now. "You found a picture of my people?" "Yes, ma'am. Your great-grandfather Samuel Thomas, your great-grandmother Grace, and their 4 children. It was taken in Richmond, Virginia." Dorothy's voice broke. "We don't have any pictures from back then." "Not a single one. The family stories say there was a portrait made once, but it was lost during the Depression when my grandmother had to move. We always wished we could see their faces." Maya felt tears in her own eyes. "Mrs. Williams, I'd like to come visit you and show you the photograph. But there's something else. We've made a discovery about your great-grandmother Grace, something remarkable about her ancestry. Would you be willing to take a DNA test?" "What kind of discovery?" Maya chose her words carefully. "We have evidence that suggests Grace was the daughter of a woman who came from Angola, from a royal lineage. Her genetic markers indicate she may have been descended from one of the most powerful queens in African history." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Maya thought the call had dropped. Then Dorothy spoke, her voice steady despite the emotion in it. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about Grace. She said Grace had healing hands, that she could look at you and see what was wrong deep inside. She said Grace had eyes that seemed to know things. Ancient things." Dorothy paused. "And she said Grace always told her children, 'Remember that you come from kings and queens. Never forget that.'" Chapter 9. The proof. 6 weeks later, Maya returned to Philadelphia with James and Patricia. They met Dorothy in her living room, where 3 generations of her family had gathered. Her daughter Karen sat beside her. Her grandson Marcus, a college student studying history, stood by the window. All of them wanted to know the truth. James opened his laptop and pulled up the genetic analysis results. He had compared Dorothy's DNA sample against the markers identified in Grace's iris pattern from the photograph, then cross-referenced everything with genetic databases. "From Angola, the results are definitive," he began. "Dorothy, you carry the same genetic markers that we identified in your great-grandmother's eyes. These markers are extremely rare, found in less than 0.1% of the global population. And they match the genetic signature of the Ndongo royal family." He pulled up a chart showing the genetic lineage. Queen Nzinga ruled the kingdom of Ndongo and Matamba from 1624 to 1663. She resisted Portuguese colonization for nearly 40 years, protecting her people and their independence. According to the genetic evidence, Grace was her direct descendant, approximately 7 generations removed. Dorothy's hand went to her mouth. Karen reached over and gripped her mother's other hand. Marcus moved closer, staring at the screen. "How is that possible?" Marcus asked. "How did a queen's descendant end up enslaved in Virginia?" Patricia spoke up, sharing what they had discovered in the archives. She told them about Nzinga, the woman who arrived on the Esperanza in 1847 claiming royal blood, about how she was sold to the Blackwell plantation, about how she died giving birth to Grace in 1858, never having returned to her homeland. "Your great-great-grandmother Grace never knew her mother," Patricia said gently, "but she carried her legacy in every cell of her body, in her healing knowledge passed down from her older half-sister. And in her eyes, those distinctive eyes that showed her royal heritage." Maya placed the photograph on the coffee table. Dorothy leaned forward. She traced her finger over Grace's image, over those remarkable eyes that had looked into the camera lens in 1888, carrying a secret that would take 131 years to uncover. "She looks like my grandmother," Dorothy whispered, "and like my mother." And like Karen, she looked up at Maya, tears streaming down her face. "All this time we had the stories, but we never had proof. We never had this." Marcus picked up the photograph carefully. "She looks like a queen, because she was descended from one," James said quietly. Chapter 10. The reunion 3 months later on a warm September afternoon, exactly 131 years after the original photograph was taken. Dorothy and her family stood in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The photograph that had started everything was now part of a permanent collection, alongside the documentation of Grace's royal lineage. But this gathering wasn't about exhibitions or displays, it was about family. Dorothy had worked with Patricia to trace every branch of the Thomas family tree. And today, more than 40 descendants of Samuel and Grace Thomas had come together. From across the country, many were meeting each other for the first time. Maya watched as they gathered around a large screen showing the digitally restored photograph. She saw Grace's features reflected in face after face, the same strong jaw, the same dignified bearing, and in several people, those same distinctive eyes. An older man named Joseph, who had traveled from Atlanta, stood staring at the image of his great-great-grandfather Samuel. "I have his carpentry tools," he said quietly. "They've been passed down through my family. I never knew what he looked like until today." A young woman named Aaliyah, Dorothy's great-niece, stood beside her. She had Grace's eyes, that same unusual iris pattern that had started the entire investigation. When James had tested her DNA as part of the expanded family study, the royal genetic markers had been unmistakable. "I always felt like there was something about our family," Aaliyah said, "some story we were missing. My grandmother used to say we came from greatness, but she didn't know how or why. She just felt it." Dorothy addressed the gathered family, her voice strong. "Grace died in 1912, never knowing that the truth about her mother would be discovered. She never knew that science would one day prove what her mother and Nzinga had claimed, that they were descended from a warrior queen who defied an empire." She paused, looking around at the faces of her family, doctors, teachers, artists, parents, students, all of them carrying Grace's legacy forward into the future. "But she knew her worth," Dorothy continued. "She knew her strength. And she made sure we knew ours." She held up the photograph, the same one taken in that modest Richmond studio in 1888. Samuel and Grace paid $2 they could barely afford so their children would remember their faces, but it became more than that. It became evidence, proof that our ancestors were not just survivors. They were royalty. Her voice rose, clear and unwavering, "And that is something no one can ever take away from us again." Marcus raised his phone and took a photograph of everyone gathered together. History repeating itself. Another family portrait. Another moment preserved. But this time, they knew who they were.